So, welcome. Really lovely to see you, Marilyn. We've been in contact a bit, so it's been really nice.
It's wonderful to be here.
Good, good. So first of all, I want to ask you about your choice of poets. So, firstly, the Gwendolyn Brooks poem, and perhaps introduce her to us, because some of us won't know her.
No. Gwendolyn Brooks was an African-American poet who was born in Chicago in 1913 and lived there all her life. The poem that was read was part of a collection called Annie Allen that was published in 1950 and was the first book by a black poet to win the Pulitzer Prize in the United States. The poem is the whole book is what some people might now call a novel in verse. The first part of which is about the childhood and adolescence of a young black woman in Chicago, and her love affair and subsequent marriage that doesn't turn out right, and besides which her husband goes off to World War II and comes back alive but mentally shell-shocked. And then the second part of the book, although it still centers around the same narrator, is much more about community and this young woman's place in the community. And the poem in question, which is part of that, which is called The Womanhood, is part of that second part. And obviously it describes, or perhaps not so obviously, because I know people who've read the poem and not quite gotten it, is about the funeral of a woman who is really too alive to stay dead. And someone who is anything but a saint, but someone who was at the same time, as described in the poem, an outlaw, the drink, the love rooms, and the things in people's eyes, which were not necessarily flattering things. But at the same time, even in the title of the poem, the rights for cousin Vit, a relative, a part of the family, and Vit, of course, Vita, life, cousin life, who is too alive to stay dead. Really, but there's one word in the middle. There's so many interesting words in that poem, but one really interesting word in I think it's the sixth line of the poem is the word surmise in the imperative, which suddenly, first of all, introduces the fact that that someone is telling this. There's a narrator. We have before that it's a poem that could be narrated by a universal, omniscient narrator, but that surmise is someone telling us to do something. And probably she, because it's probably Annie, in fact, is saying, imagine. And so on the second or third time you read the poem, you realize that this resurrection is all about hope. It's all about the narrator saying, imagine if she got up and walked out and she's too alive to stay dead. So it's at once a poem about resurrection, the hope of resurrection, maybe the possibility of resurrection, but the hope still being there.
Thank you. And the Hayden Carr, again, a poet I don't know at all.
Well, Hayden Carr was Carruth, I think he pronounced it, another American poet who was born in 1921, and one of that, I think, incredible generation of American poets born in the 1920s, ranging from Hayden Carruth and Marie Pinceau in 1921 to Adrienne Rich in 1929, and including James Merrill, including Philip Levine, Carruth was a real eccentric and a real genius, I think. He spent most of his life living in either first rural Vermont and then later very rural upstate New York. He was violently agoraphobic, which was one reason that he spent most of his life living off the beaten track, while at the same time being a incredible lover of jazz who knew everything about jazz, also a great admirer of Basho, and a virtuoso in both in received forms and all kinds of wonderful open forms. But the paragraph was a form that he invented himself. In fact, during a long stay in a mental hospital when he was in his late 30s to keep himself sane. And it's a 15-line form with a fairly complex both rhyme and metric scheme that you could hardly hear when you listen to to that particular poem. But he went on and worked with it mostly in sequences all of his long life. He died at the age of 86 in 2008. And this is part of a sequence just called Paragraphs that is largely about the horrible things that have happened to rural Vermont, and a sequence also written in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, written in the long ago aftermath of World War II, in which he was a soldier. So he's, but again, I'm just thinking of it now that it's like the Cousin Vitt poem. It's at once a poem about despair and possibility and hope. Perhaps I think much less hopeful than the Gwendolyn Brooks poem because there's a revolutionary is somebody who's got to keep on with the fight even when there's no hope left, and then we're ending with even the universe is a state. Now ask me if I'm really an anarchist, which he was.
And I'm going to come back to some of your, because you've got your paragraphs to Hayden yourself. You've used the paragraph yourself.
Yes, I mean, one of the things that I thought, and I think many people, that the way that someone has always invented whatever form it is in whatever language, and when somebody else comes along and uses it, well, then that's one step for it to enter the language. So I did indeed use the same.
Good. So I want to talk a bit more about your influences for a moment. Reading one interview with you, someone asked you, as they always ask you, your use of metrical form, and you say it's a way of entering into conversation with other poets, contemporary and long gone. And this sense I had anyway of conversations with poets, with Shakespeare in your sonnet sequence, Love, Death, and the Changing Seasons, as well as Adrian Rich. And then in Names...
And George Meredith.
And George Meredith, that's right. And then in Names, your recent collection, there's a letter to Alfred Korn, there's a letter to Mimi Calvati. And then there's your glose. I don't know what the plural of glose is.
Glosa. No, glosa is the singular in Spanish.
In a way, they're sort of conversations as well.
Yeah.
So I was wondering whether for you, poetry is a conversation spanning generations, transcending national boundaries. It seems to be.
Yeah, in a word, yes. And I mean, for me, that was one of the very first impulses to write poetry was not just to imitate, but to somehow or other correspond with, converse with, whether it was John Donne or T.S. Eliot or Gerard Manley Hopkins or Edna St. Vincent Millay or whoever it was that I was that I was reading, starting at somewhere in my early teens. And in a sense, even doing one's first hesitant, formal imitations of what another poet has done is also a kind of conversation with another poet, and sometimes themes or words or different idea on same subject, completely opposing idea on same subject would also be part of that conversation.
I want to come back to that as we go along, but before I do that, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your childhood. This is where I feel like a sort of psychoanalyst. I want to say, tell me about your childhood, but I do want you to tell me about your childhood. I mean, particularly your childhood makes appearances in your poems. I'm thinking of paragraphs from a day book, for instance, where you talk about your grandmother and you talk about Jewish history. And talking about that, I wanted you to sort of say a little bit about the world you were born into, New York and so on.
Nothing terribly special about it. My mother was an elementary school teacher, and my father was a chemical engineer, more often out of work than not. I went to state schools in New York, and then went to university, and then grew up. Yes.
I mean, one of the feelings...
It wasn't a terribly literary childhood, except in one way, and that was the magic gift of... it was a gift, and it was an earned gift that because I could write and sign my print and sign my name at the age of 4, I could have a library card, and be able to borrow books from the public library. And that
at the age of 4.
Yes,
that's fairly literary childhood, isn't it? I didn't get one until I was about 17. But. That was just an opening of everything from borrowing picture book from the library, picture books meant for children of 4 or 5, or discovering things like the purple fairy book and the yellow fairy book and the red fairy book, and perhaps a year or so later, and getting those as well, and just that incredible wealth possible, and I think public libraries are to be protected and taken care of at all. Indeed, yes.
Yes.
I mean, going on from that, one of the feelings I get from your work, and in a way this goes back to what we were saying about the poetry of the conversation, is just how deeply and broadly immersed in poetry your life has been. You're reading John Donne, reading Auden, all your work in poetry translation, which we're not even going to be able to touch on very much in this interview. Your sense of connectedness with the Middle East. I wanted to ask you how poetry entered your life, both reading it and writing it.
I think the way it usually does through anthology, but there again, the public library, because as is probably still the case, there was not a lot of poetry formally taught in schools, at least not until one was 12 or 13 years old or even older, but just discovering and perhaps being guided to the poetry shelf the 800s in the Dewey Decimal System, and just plucking out books or anthologies and discovering the people that one likes at a very young age, like Dylan Thomas or E.E. Cummings, and then all kinds of other things, but just again when I think of it, just that the good luck of the library, because it wasn't necessarily offered in school, and I've recalled having conversations with people my own age or younger, talking about we were forced to memorize poems in school, and I said, good Lord, I wish I had been. And of course, it's not. In fact, my answer is not. Well, you were forced to learn the multiplication tables, I presume, and you were forced, to learn to conjugate Latin verbs if you were studying Latin. Why is memorizing poetry something you were forced to do when all these other things were just part of what you were meant to be learning? And so, and I don't know how that idea has crept in that somehow memorizing poetry is something you're forced to do rather than it's part of the curriculum. That's
it's interesting. So many people talk about that they're forced to learn poetry, almost at gunpoint.
Yes. Being able to recite My Last Duchess is a lot more interesting than the nines table or even the 13s table.
Yes, indeed. I mean, interestingly, in some of your poetry, there's also an ambivalence about writing. there's one point where you talk about the urge to write one's life instead of living it. And then another poem you talk about, there is pleasure too in writing easy, dishonest verse. So perhaps tell us about your ambivalence about writing, because writing is so central to your life, isn't it?
Well, I suppose anything that's central to one's life is something about which one. Not anything, no. That's an overlarge, but at least some things that are central to one's life, whether an art or a vocation or the person with whom one's living, or one's children. One can be ambivalent about them at times. And as far as I think any writer knows the uneasy pleasure of writing something that was in fact easy to write and sounds good, but it's not the right thing or the real thing.
Yes, indeed. So moving on to the poems a bit more. So your 1986 collection, Love, Death and the Changing Seasons, probably one of your most well-known books, is a novel in verse about a lesbian love affair. So I'm going to ask you personal questions. So I know you married the science fiction writer Samuel R. Delaney in 1961, when I was born, and have a daughter. So when I was talking to you just now about your daughter, I was still seeing the daughter of your poems. In that collection, especially in that collection, you can be very frank about sex and sexuality. Writing about lesbian sexuality in 1986 must have felt quite a risk in a way, or... Anyway, you were one of the first people to be doing it, Rima. Can you say something about coming out and how that shaped your poetry, if it has? I'm thinking of poems like Nights of 1962, for instance.
Which is in fact a poem, not a poem about coming out. Comes in the last.
Yes,
in the last two lines, and it's really one of those ubi sunt about 1962, in the late 1970s and 1980s, there was such an incredible opening and flowering of both women's writing, whether lesbian or not lesbian or not related to sexuality at all, but an affirmation of women's writing in all of its shapes and forms, and at the same time, an opening up in terms of gay and lesbian writers both being able to write about not just sex and sexuality, but also love and desire and disappointment. That even someone like Tom Gunn wrote his first, I think, openly identifiably gay poems at that time, even though this wasn't a change in his life, but it was a change in what he could write about. Although I think that was also the great pressure of the AIDS epidemic that made it necessary to speak out and about things about which he had that he hadn't been ambivalent, but that he had veiled in metaphor and not made clear before.
And do you think it's shaped your voice as a poet?
And what the women's movement and the gay and lesbian movement?
Coming out.
Absolutely. I think the movement for both women's poetry and gay and lesbian poetry, I think, probably shaped my voice as a poet at least as much as the actual fact of first having a relationship with a woman, because if that had happened in 1952, aside from the fact that I was 8, but I mean, if I were a couple of decades older, or and had that experience a couple of decades earlier, it wouldn't. I would probably not have written about it in the same way. I mean, even. I was going to say that even Adrienne Rich's poems about lesbian relationships and lesbian sexuality, in part because also her own coming out was in the same, even though she was considerably older, was in the same period, but it was that time and place that made it possible to write about it that might not have been, that wasn't possible for people, and in that case I would say women and men both, to write about that even 15 or so years earlier.
Very interesting. Continuing on with the poems, one of the recurring themes in your poetry is, I think, the experience of living in a body, being in a body. Obviously, a woman's body.
But yes, a human body.
Yeah, a human body. Yes,
with all its failings.
With all its failings, and you write very candidly about desire, about the pleasures of the body. Also, you write very frankly about the pains of the body. So I was very moved to read the poems in your collection, Winter Numbers, which circle again and again around death, around cancer, around AIDS. For instance, I'm thinking of the brutally frank poem Against Elegies. I happened, sometimes when a new book, I opened it at random and read Against Elegies, and I had that very strong experience of stepping into poetry. It was a brutally frank but beautiful poem. Perhaps you could say something about that collection and your own experience then. And
Oof.
if you want to, you can say no, I don't.
I don't quite know what to say. I mean, not that there's anything that both the experience of living through in the time of the AIDS epidemic, having so many friends, some of whom were also public figures like Audre Lorde, and others who were simply private people I knew because I knew them, at the same time, who were women in particular who had breast cancer and who died of it, and then I had the same experience myself, and also having my partner at the time was and still is a healthcare worker who works with people with HIV and AIDS, and so that was part of my life through that being my private life here. When you live with someone who's doing that every day.
And you write about that,
yes,
don't you?
Yes,
That's quite
yes.
a bit about that. There is a sort of brutality about the poems. A sort of I must sort of just say the word, all the words. It was that part of your. I mean, they're beautifully made, but they're brutal as well.
Well, I suppose in an odd way, it's a balance of if you're going to, not that one implies the other, but just as it's possible to write at once formally and I hope lyrically, but also very explicitly about sex. Well, you can also write formally and lyrically and very explicitly about pain and disease. They're both equally parts of the life of the body.
And both need to be written down.
Yes.
Another theme that, in this interview this time, I'm sort of exploring the themes because I personally found the themes of the poem so strong. So a recurrent theme in your work, if I've got it right, is the journal poem. There are poems that are called journals, but there's a sense of journal quite often. Again and again, you come back to the poet writing, the table that you write on, the view, the streets around you. I'm thinking of poems like Dusk, July, from Winter Numbers, Scars on Paper from Squares and Courtyards for Destino in Names. And it slightly reminded me of Matisse in that way, in the sense of him working away so much in the studio. He was very much a studioso while the world burnt almost around him. But his vision was that was where he was going to make sense of everything from the studio. And it's almost like your table, which you call my monkish notebook at one point, on your pine table facing the window. It's almost as if your monkish notebook and your pine table is like your artist's studio from which you make sense of the world. Is that your...
Yes, in a word, yes. And I think it's very often by, at least if one is a writer, whether poet, novelist, essayist, that it is by writing that you make sense of the world.
There's almost a sense in which you're trying to stitch together the world.
Yeah, or that you find out what you're thinking by writing it, or you make or you connect things that you wouldn't have connected, or that you haven't quite realized were concerning you or even obsessing you when you start.
And what's interesting is that you keep in all that, don't you? The view from the window,
Well, sometimes, I mean, there's as with anything else, there's reams that gets taken out.
Of course. But somehow that does add to this sense of the studio, your life in the studio. And then, of course, there's the other theme is this, and I think it seems to be increasing, is a strong political dimension of the writing. Though I think in your poems, politics is always linked with the immediate and personal, a sense of wanting to honour both. I was feeling when I was reading the poems that the poems are both alert and bothered about the world. And it made me think of a term that I used a lot when I was at art school and getting involved, only very timidly in my case in gay politics, is this phrase that we used to use, the personal is political, which was very much around, wasn't it? And your work very much reminds me of that.
And there's also, the flip side of that, which is that the political is personal, whether you want it to be or not.
In what sense?
Well, the political is in many ways what shapes your daily life. I think it's one of the things I like about that Hayden Carr poem. He's not writing about something that's going on hundreds of miles away from, or thousands of miles away from where he is. He's talking about the valley and the mountain where he's living, where he lives, where he's lived for decades, that is being destroyed by commercialism and multinational corporations. And so, I mean, certainly in that case, the political is what is affecting is what's directly affecting his personal life. Indeed, I will admit that that the fact that I am very close to some people who are Palestinian and Syrian and whose lives I know about because you know about your friends' lives has something to do with why I am concerned with those particular struggles, for example.
I mean, it also reminded me of Auden's poetry in the sense of his moral. Auden is many kinds of poem, but he's also very much a moral and a public poet.
Yes.
And I wondered whether you think of yourself. I began to feel that you're a sort of poet of conscience, and I wondered whether you were also trying to be a public poet in that sense.
Well, I don't mind if I certainly don't mind if I am, and Auden, and Auden has been one of my favorite poets since I was about 15. So, so that's all right.
Well, that's good. And
although Auden, of course, no, in fact, Auden never abandoned his public stance. It just shifted from being political to contemplative and even religious, and but I don't think he thought in any case that he could integrate the two, which doesn't have to be like that.
But he was definitely trying to sort of morally teach as well, wasn't he?
Yes, always. Whether he was writing about Spain or whether he was a sequence like Gnomes is an intensely public and intensely moral poem, and it manages to be both about the political life and in fact about religion, because I mean his metaphor is that of the Christian Passion, but at the same time, but it's not just a poem about the Passion. It's
a wonderful sequence as well. A wonderful sequence. Yes, I'm thinking of an example of that. A sequence in Names, going back to Hayden Carr, is the paragraphs for Hayden. I know that there's this wonderful paragraph about this girl in Gaza. A passionata was a wonderful thing. And I know you wanted it published in PN Review at the time. So that made me think about this moral responsibility of writing. I've been recently rereading Robert Hass, and he talks about that the poet's job is to refresh the idea of justice. And I wondered whether
that's marvelous. Yes.
I wondered whether that's your feeling, that you're trying to refresh the idea of justice, particularly in that selection.
That's his marvelous line, but it is true that poetry, when it works, because of course there's dreadful political poetry, there's also dreadful apolitical poetry, but poetry, when it works as poetry, refreshes the idea of whatever it's about. And it can be perhaps more important for it to refresh the idea of justice than to refresh the idea of the seasons changing, although refreshing the idea of the seasons changing might lead one to think about ecology and why the seasons aren't changing the way they used to.
Another theme I see running through your work, and I think this links with a strong sort of social communal sense in your poetry, is the street. It brought to mind the poetry of Tom Gunn that you were mentioning earlier. He says that I love streets. I could stand on the street and look at people all day in the same way that Wordsworth could look at lakes.
Yes.
Lovely. So that really, you're like Gunn in the sense of he's got this wonderful formal skill, like yourself, but also this sense of the street. Your streets strike me as more meditative, perhaps, arising out of the act of writing. Could you say something about you and streets? There's so many streets in your poems.
No, I'm with Tom Gunn on that, as long as it's not really pissing down rain.
Yes.
And even then, at least in Paris where I live, you can sit in a cafe and look out at the street. But yeah, it's always whatever city or town you happen to be in, it always seems to be a kind of microcosm of human existence.
And there for you seems to be a conscience about the street. There's a poem, I can't remember which one now, about a mad woman that is near you whilst you're writing, and
sitting on a stone half circle near the Seine in a park
so it seems to be a sort of conscience about the street almost.
And there's the way the street interposes or imposes itself on whatever often enough, and the situations of other people and how they are juxtaposed with or with each other, or how they contradict each other.
Yes, indeed. So, moving on to what was I going to say? The other thing that critics are saying about your work, and I think is true, is that the tone and the themes of your work have darkened over time. You could say that, possibly. I don't know.
Yes.
There's drinking tequila in nights of 1964, and they're all reliable. Then to a poem like Morning News, which is for me a wonderful evocation of the news and the reality of the news. I was reading your poem in the Poetry magazine Poem, and what it made me wonder is whether I was starting to think Marilyn is a war poet. Is what I began to feel. In one poem, you say
I was going to say even the Nights of 1964 ends with two of the other people who've been in that bar. In fact, one dead of AIDS, one dead of cancer.
Yes,
so,
of course, I mean, would you think of yourself as a war poet? Poet?
Considering the times we live in, it's hard not to be a war poet.
It's interesting, though, because I was mentioning to a friend the other day, and they said, well, when you mention war poets, you're always thinking of the First World War and the Second World War. And we just forget that there's been war continuously ever since.
Yes, I mean, and what is, is Mahmoud Darwish a war poet? And in a way he is. I mean, more than in a way. I mean, he's... so many interesting, and what poet would Mahmoud Darwish have been without war? But
and do you think that has become more of a theme in your own writing?
Well, again, perhaps only because of events with which I have felt more personally involved than wars that happened before I was born, or were even Vietnam, which I was certainly not before I was born, but was far away. And with all the protest marches and somehow or other, the American invasion of Iraq, which felt like a war. First of all, like a war crime from the start. Second of all, everyone knew it was going to happen, and I managed to take part in demonstrations in 3 different cities: Paris, New York, and Washington. And I know that the hugest one was here in England, and yet we somehow all knew that it wasn't going to make a damn bit of difference. But there was. And I think in a different way than not because Vietnam was any better than Iraq, but because the war in Vietnam had already started, was rolling on, and suddenly, or gradually rather, people became aware of what was happening and the absolute unnecessity of it happening. Whereas with Iraq, people were aware before it happened. Don't do this, and it was so. I think perhaps that was a different kind of engagement.
I mean, that's the other thing that I noticed is that your sense of, and I think you should be troubled by war. Your sense of being troubled by war is doubly troubled by America. You talk about, in my name, sons and sisters die elsewhere, our homespun junta exports the war machine, millions of reason to fear and hate my country. Those are just sort of lines I plucked out, but there's a sort of troubled concern about the US.
And when it actually could do something, it doesn't.
Right.
No. Well, yes. I mean, it's no, but it's a troubling concern to be a citizen of the great global hegemon, or what perhaps used to be the great global hegemon. I don't know whether it still will be in a decade from now. But it weighs on one's conscience. Even the language weighs on one's conscience.
Of course. And then moving to a conclusion, in a way, if I was to sort of sum up what I got from reading the poems, is that I think this is peopled poetry. I felt that very strongly, that the people are very vivid throughout. It's unusual for a poet to include, in a way, so many people. People are everywhere. Addressed to people, about people, people walk through them. It's a world. It's about a shared world. You're shared with your daughter, with lovers, with friends. A world shared by people on the street, in other countries, in war, in exile. Exile, I think, seems to be is an important word in your lexicon. I slightly wondered, on reflection, if this is a sort of spiritual heart of your work. In a way, the problem of other people, the fact that we share this world with other people, and the responsibility and the spiritual responsibility almost that brings. Would you say that? I know I've just said it. But.
Yes. Well, I would assent. I would assent to that our responsibility beyond ourselves is certainly not all of, but part of our spiritual responsibility as human beings.
I feel that there's a reaching out from self into a shared world and a conscience of a shared world, and what that means for one's behaviour and actions and so on. And then just finally, I always ask this of every guest we have, what is poetry for you? Is it a political action? Is it a testament of war? Is it cherishing the good? What is poetry for in our world, in our shared world?
Reading poetry is sometimes it's not a guilty pleasure, but in that one can be enlightened and informed even about things that are horrific at the same time as having the pleasure, and it is a pleasure, of reading a poem that is made well, and it can be a poem that is made well about the most terrible kinds of things, I think that even go both with reading it, certainly with and then writing poetry, is finding out what we talked about. We did talk about that before, but somehow finding out what one thinks and feels in the act of writing it, and sometimes I think that also happens reading poetry, that it's not oh yes, this is I assent, I'm all for that, or but finding out that things are perhaps more complex, or that there's a different way of thinking about something and a different way of phrasing something than one would ever have thought oneself, and there it is in a poem. But that one has just picked up a book or picked up a journal, and there it is.
So that's a great place to finish. Thank you very much, Marilyn.
Thank you.